And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Tonight's featured show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Welcome to the Republic News Network for our live national broadcast. You may call me Kelby, and tonight I'm going to be acting as your moderator. The RNN, which stands for the Republic News Network, has been doing this radio show since 2010, and it's always been a friendly introduction for the people of the United States Corporation. Here we go. It's true. The United States is a federal corporation, and their exclusive jurisdiction is in the District of Columbia. The Republic government was simply a bunch of U.S. citizens that in law don't have access to the Bill of Rights, and they realized they wanted to be Americans as our founders and our law provided each and every one of us. See, we've been hard at work since 2008, and since 2010, we have successfully re-inhabited the original government vacated under Lincoln in 1861. I know, it's hard to understand. Don't worry. We are law-abiding, peaceful Americans and very pro-government, and we love our country. You can consider the Republic members are tired of the corruption that we see every day. See, we found in the law that there is two forms of government here on the land, and we did something about it. We are people. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. We have families just like you. We simply found some truths, and now we're sharing these important truths with the rest of the world. So get ready to hear things that sound amazing, and get ready to understand that you too are about to be a part of history. We welcome each one of you to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel and your Republic if you so choose. But before we go into our broadcast tonight, please bow your head in prayer. Thank you, Lord, for this show. Thank you, Lord, for people that are willing to stand up and tell the truth. Father God, we ask that you bless this call. You bless the people that are on the call, teaching information that most people just wouldn't say. And Lord, literally risking their lives. Just cover them with your angels, cover their life, cover their family, cover their domains. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Dan, I yield.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a terrific program tonight on Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel radio program. Our guests this evening are Paul Driessen and Dr. Tim Ball, both extremely expert in the field of climate science and are, I guess, what the radical zealots of climate change would refer to as climate deniers. And this is going to be an interesting program this evening because we've got a lot of change that's happened over the last 3 weeks or 2 weeks with the election of President Trump and some of the obvious changes in the direction of our country that should come out of this election. We've been following a pretty much lockstep path in our country's history into a climate change fraud that has changed the entire makeup of our culture, the entire makeup of our political system, and plans to change the entire makeup of our world government and many of the things that are happening in the country and around the world, using propaganda to sell climate policy to convince us that capitalism is bad and that communism and socialism is good. And tonight's program, we call the program When Propaganda Passes for Science, using propaganda to sell climate policy. I'd like to welcome our guests and thank them for being brave enough to speak truthfully against the well-funded and organized progressives that are promoting the false science and the narrative of the left. We've got an interesting program because we're going to be talking about a group of progressives that have literally tried to silence the voices of reason that say, wait a minute, the science is not settled. There's no such thing as settled science. Science is not science if we can't continually test and retest and reprove the theorems that science is based on. And I have an interesting lead into this because on March 29th of this year, a group of progressive attorneys general and Al Gore and a handful of elected political representatives formed a group called AGs United for Clean Power. And that group threatened to file charges against ExxonMobil and other conservative groups, the so-called climate change deniers, using RICO statutes and their extraordinary subpoena powers as attorneys general that are granted under the Martin Act. And this was called patently unconstitutional by legal authorities pretty much nationwide. And so with that, I'd like to start the discussion tonight with Paul Driessen and Dr. Tim Ball. Paul, I'd like to start by introducing you and thank you for being on the call and what you feel about this progressive group. They're trying to use RICO against people who just are trying to protect their First Amendment and their Fourth Amendment rights.
Well, you're absolutely on target, and thanks for having me on your show, Dan. We are talking about totalitarianism at its worst, Spanish Inquisition, the various fascist governments of the past century, trying to silence and intimidate everyone that disagrees with them. Before we get too heavily into that, I'd like to lay one little bit of groundwork. You use the term, and the other side uses the term, always climate denier. And I emphasize, and I know Tim is on board with this as well, my background's geology and ecology, environmental law. I'm absolutely not a climate change denier. I know climate change has affected the Earth ever since it was formed. It comes repeatedly, sometimes in somewhat regular fluctuations, sometimes unexpected ones, but the ice ages, the little ice ages, the interregnums, between the big ice ages, the drought periods, the wet periods, the storm and not stormy periods, they're a fact of life, always have been and always will be. So I am not a believer in dangerous man-made climate change, but I am a believer in climate change. And I think most fundamentally the issue is not whether CO2 affects Earth's climate. The question is whether those emissions have overwhelmed all the multiple powerful natural forces that have always governed the climate, and whether humans are now causing dangerous warming or climate change. And I don't think there's any real-world evidence outside our windows in the real world that this is happening. And in fact, I think we can say a moderately warmer planet with more atmospheric carbon dioxide would hugely benefit plant growth, wildlife, and humans with few or no minimal climate effects. But a colder planet with less CO2 would punish people. It would shorten growing seasons and reduce arable land. A lot more problems for all of mankind. And if we indeed had a chillier and CO2-deprived planet with less reliable, less affordable energy, that would really threaten habitat, species, people's nutrition, our prosperity, and especially the poorest people among all of us. I think that's really important stuff to keep in mind.
Well, I think that is absolutely a perfect summary of a lot of our points of view, and I do stand corrected. I should have said man-caused global climate change deniers, because I think we all share the skepticism about that. Dr. Ball, I've always been a huge fan of yours. I've seen you on several movie productions. You've been an expert in this many times. I would like to hear what your feeling about this very subject is.
Well, thank you for the kind words, and I can say amen to what Paul said. And Paul might recall that our first meeting occurred at a restaurant called the Monocle in Washington several years ago when I made a presentation about this, and he kindly gave me a copy of his very, very incisive and intuitive book, Eco-Imperialism. But the other thing I wanted to comment on, I've been both a global warming skeptic and a climate change denier. And that's significant because, of course, this marginalizing of you into you're outside the mainstream. It's part of the same consensus argument, which, of course, is nonsense because it doesn't apply to science. But when the original theorem was global warming, which was human CO2 was going to increase the CO2 in the atmosphere, which would cause increased global temperature. And so then we were global warming skeptics. And I pointed out that all scientists are skeptics, as you did in your introduction. If you're not a skeptic, you're not a scientist. And then around 2000, they ran into the problem that Thomas Huxley talked about over 100 years ago when he said that the great tragedy of science is a lovely hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact. And the fact was that the CO2 temperature kept going up, but the temperature started to level off and, in fact, go down slightly. But instead of going back and revisiting their science, as proper scientists would do, in other words, if your projection is wrong, your science is wrong, or your prediction is wrong, your science is wrong, they moved the goalposts. They stopped calling it global warming, and they started calling it climate change. And in the leaked emails from the University of East Anglia Climatic Research Unit, there is actually a discussion of that in the year 2004, where they're saying, look, people are starting to ask questions because we're having cold winters, and global warming is a hard sell. Maybe we should call it climate change. So all of that was premeditated. Of course, if you change from global warming to climate change, you also got to change the invective. And the invective changed from global warming to climate change denier, with all of the Holocaust connotations associated with that. As Paul correctly pointed out, I don't know of anybody that's a climate change denier. I do know of quite a lot of people, and increasingly more, thank goodness, who are opposed to the idea that human activities are the cause of that. But this is for me, this is proof that it's a political issue, the fact that you have to change the name-calling instead of changing your science. But the other comment I wanted to make was I also was privileged to attend the first Heartland Conference, there was one in Europe earlier, but this was really the first world conference on the skeptics' view of climate change. And my opening comment to them was, I've waited 40 years for this day. But more important was the comment of the keynote speaker, Václav Klaus of the Czech Republic, who was the only world leader to stand up opposed to what was going on. And his opening comment was, look, we've just come through 70 years of communism. Why the heck would you want to go back to that? And, of course, that got a standing ovation. And he summarized it all in what we're talking about today in his beautiful book, the wonderful title, Blue Planet in Green Shackles. That's such a wonderful title, but the subtitle of it is, What is Endangered, Climate or Freedom? And that's exactly what we're talking about here today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ball. I think you're absolutely correct in your observations about this. I do have to mention, and I'd like to get your feedback on this, the fact that there are literally so-called climate change zealots worldwide that are calling for criminal prosecutions against anyone questioning the so-called science, the science is settled argument. What do you guys say about that?
Well, I think you're absolutely on target right there. We are a major threat to their power structure, to their money for their research, to their power grab over our economies, our livelihoods, our living standards. They're gunning for a complete transformation of the global economic order. They want to redistribute wealth from those countries that create it to those who want it. They want to replace capitalism with a UN-centered global economic order, and they want to control people's lives, their energy supplies, all under the guise of sustainability and climate change. And for the poor countries, they're not obligated to cut any of their carbon use or their carbon dioxide or other emissions. They are exempted from all of that. But the reason, besides that exemption, that they're on board with this climate treaty is it's promising them billions of dollars every year as part of this loss and damages climate adaptation and compensation fund. The idea being that fossil fuel use by rich countries is causing all the extreme weather and the hurricanes and tornadoes and so forth that might strike them, and maybe even the earthquakes and volcanic activity when you listen to some of these crazies. But they want that money, and in fact, I'm just looking at something that CFAC sent me, that's Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, where I'm a senior policy advisor. They sent me a memo from Marrakech. They're over there in Morocco right now, battling the crazies that are there, wailing and gnashing their teeth over Trump being the new president instead of Hillary Clinton. And one of the guys from Tonga, the island in the Pacific, says, "You're Americans. When are you going to send us the money?" And what they want is billions of dollars every year in this loss and damages fund, and have this go on in perpetuity. Every time there's any kind of a natural disaster, we're supposed to send them more money because we rich countries caused the natural disaster. So we skeptics of dangerous man-made climate change are a threat to that whole world order, all their fancy five-star restaurants and hotels every year for the climate conferences, the power structure that puts them in the catbird seat over everything we make, ship, eat, and do, and this entire boatload of money that they expect to be getting as a new form of global welfare so that they can put it in the leaders' Swiss bank accounts. That's what's really going on here.
Oh, and I couldn't agree more with that. And, of course, it was deliberately set up by Maurice Strong, who, by the way, died in China, where his sister his aunt Anna Strong, who had been a declared Marxist since the age of 15, she went over and reportedly had an affair with Mao Zedong. But Strong was the architect behind the United Nations Environment Program. And Elaine Dewar, who wrote a book called Cloak of Green, was a Canadian investigative journalist. She wanted to write a book in praise of Canadian environmentalists and people like David Suzuki and Maurice Strong. And as a good journalist, the more she researched, the more she discovered that these people were more political and more evil in their desires and goals than the people they were attacking. And Dewar, after 5 days at the UN with Maurice Strong, drew the conclusion that Strong was using the UN as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. So that was the objective from the start. I like Paul's reference to the small islands in the Pacific. Of course, one of the problems, or they were exploited, and this is how it was done. And I mean, there's so much deviousness and manipulation behind all of this. But the United Nations had a problem when it was set up, that it was one nation, one vote. And of course, that meant that very small nations had the same vote as, say, China or India. So it's totally undemocratic. But of course, they didn't want to do it by population of country, because that would have then meant that China would have ruled the world. And so they stuck with the one nation, one vote, and then they set up the Security Council to effectively control it. But what Maurice Strong realized was that if you wanted to get something through the United Nations, all you had to do was tell these South Pacific and other low-lying countries, small islands, that, sea level is going to drown you out. And there's that incredible picture of the cabinet of the Maldive Islands meeting in scuba gear underwater. I mean, it's just farcical. But as Paul said, they were promised all kinds of money in return for the damage done to them. But then that gave Strong, 64 or 68 very simple and easily achieved votes to win anything that he wanted in the United Nations. So, yeah, it's been about global governance, and it's been about transfer of wealth. That's what Kyoto was all about. And Kyoto got exposed because the meeting in Marrakesh is what they call a Conference of the Parties, a COP. It's COP 21. And at those Conference of the Parties, they determine the political and financial money that's going to be directed to all of this. By the way, at least of the 10,000 people that are going to be there, over half of them will be NGOs, that is, non-government organizations, which means Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and all of these other environmental groups, and all funded by the taxpayer. But this was all part of Strong's agenda. The other people that are there are virtually all appointed by weather agencies from every nation of the World Meteorological Organization, the UN agency. Again, Strong did that because he wanted to put the bureaucrats in control. And one of the things that we're facing, and in fact Trump is going to face, is dealing with the bureaucrats and running the bureaucrats. And it's going to be a huge job because, as Mary McCarthy said several years ago, bureaucracy, the rule of no one, the modern form of despotism. And so he got the IPCC made up of people from all the national weather agencies, which then put the bureaucrats in charge. And they could, of course, then tell their national politicians, hey, we're the experts. We know what's going on. This is the policy that you've got to invoke. And so the politicians simply got end run on all of this. So Marrakesh, of course, is the follow-on from the Paris conference. And the most important COP conference, by the way, and by the way, the COP can only act on the scientific information that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, give them. And the IPCC were deliberately directed and restricted in a premeditated move, again by Strong, where they were given the definition of climate change they had to look at, and it was only look at human causes. Well, you can't possibly determine human causes if you don't know natural causes and include all the variability in them. But that's exactly what he wanted. And so what happened was at COP15 in Copenhagen, they were going to approve the Kyoto Protocol, and then somebody, and of course again they blame Russian hackers, but it wasn't Russian hackers. Somebody released emails from the Climatic Research Unit which showed the corruption of all these scientists, how they were getting editors fired, how they were peer reviewing each other's work. And of course that then undermined the Kyoto Protocol, which disappeared. But of course, as Paul said, these people don't give up. A year later in Durban, at COP16, they passed the Green Climate Fund, which was exactly the same thing as Kyoto under a different title, and that was ratified in Paris. And of course, that's what they're working on in Durban right now. So it's just an incredible story of manipulation of governments at all levels, purely to achieve that one world government agenda that Elaine Dewar understood after interviewing Strong for 5 days.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm going to put a couple of quotes in here to really add some foundational material to what you've both just said, and that is, and this is a quote from James Paul Warburg before the U.S. Senate on February 7th, 1950. And James Paul Warburg was the son of Paul Warburg, one of the architects of the Federal Reserve System that basically prints our currency under the Federal Reserve Act. And this is his quote, quote, "We shall have world government, whether or not we like it. The only question is whether world government will be achieved by conquest or consent," unquote. And then I've got another one here that I will also quote, and this is Rowan Gaither, the president of the Ford Foundation, and this was in 1954, and incidentally, Mr. Gaither ended up being also one of the top echelons of the Council on Foreign Relations. And this quote, "We operate here under directives that emanate from the White House. The substance of the directives under which we operate is that we shall use our grant-making power to alter life in the United States so that we can comfortably be merged with the Soviet Union," unquote. So with that, I'll let you gentlemen continue on with this discussion, because it is about world government.
Yeah, it absolutely is. What they really want to do is bring the U.S. standards of living down to meet somewhere in between where India and Africa are now and where we are. They want to lift up the people of India and Africa a little bit, but not too much, because that wouldn't be sustainable. They want to lift them up according to what might be achievable with wind and solar power, but they really don't want them using coal and oil and natural gas or nuclear power. That horse is out of the chute already, and they're not going to get it back. So this part of it, I think, is going to be one of the battles for the future. But the developing countries have served notice that they have no intention of following any of these carbon-based energy or carbon dioxide emission guidelines or standards. That's just for the developing country, for the developed countries, who in turn are obligated to become less and less rich every year by reducing their economic growth and standards of living. But also, while they're becoming less rich, they're supposed to give more and more money to the poor countries. So it's just an insane system. Let me bring up something else that you sort of both just touched on a little bit. And that's these island nations that are supposedly drowning. Just a quick reminder, the last ice age drew so much water out of the oceans and turned it into snow and ice that our oceans went down 400 feet below where they are today. We didn't have a little land bridge between Asia and North America. We had a whole continent practically between Asia and North America. It was a massive amount of land, and that's how animals and people crossed over from one continent to the other. After the last ice age ended 10, 12,000 years ago, the waters started to rise. So they have gone back up 400 feet. And right now they're rising at about 6 or 7 inches per century. So it's hardly something that's going to drown all our coastal communities, even if all these areas like Greenland and the Arctic and the Antarctic start melting down to nothing, when in reality those areas are all growing ice back, especially in Greenland and Antarctica at record rates. So the whole basis for this climate alarmism, this dangerous man-made warming scare, is garbage. It's all phony science. It's all assertions that have no basis in reality. You look outside your window, you don't see what's in the computer models or in these press releases. It's all bunk, and we have to keep that in mind every moment.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. My comment initially is about what's going on with the Trump election and happened in Brexit. And it comes from my interest is in the impact of climate change on human history. And so I've been looking at that for 40 years. And I linked that with, I took seniors on tours of Europe for 20 years. One of the places we visited was Pompeii, and through my liberal arts education, I learned Latin, and we looked at graffiti. One of the pieces of graffiti there said, because there was an election going on, said, if we get rid of this bunch of scoundrels, we just get another bunch of scoundrels. So the public attitude is, look, one leader to the next is not significant. One of the things that won the election for Trump, and Huckabee had talked about this because he'd measured it at the Trump rallies, he said 30% of the people at Trump rallies had never voted before. Now, this wasn't young people. This was across the age spectrum. And, of course, they hadn't voted before because they knew that you get rid of one bunch of scoundrels, you just get another bunch of scoundrels. But they had reached a point where they'd had enough. So when I looked at the history, and I'm talking about Toynbee and Ariel Durant, looking back at all the civilizations, was there a point at which the people would say, no, we don't want these scoundrels, we're going to get rid of them? And it came down to two things. One was a failure of the food supply, and you saw that's what actually was the catalyst for the French Revolution, because the enmity between the aristocrats and the peasants was there before. It's still there now in France. Really didn't change anything. And then you see it in the Egyptian riots recently, which Obama turned into democracy riots. In fact, they were food riots because the price of food had gone through the roof. And Obama saw it as an opportunity to get rid of Hosni Mubarak and put in the Muslim Brotherhood. You also see it going on in Venezuela right now. So if the food supply fails, the people will get rid of the leaders. The other reason they'll get rid of the leaders is when they sense that those leaders think they are there not at the will of the people. And so that takes two forms. For example, when King James said, you know, I'm here by divine right, they chopped his head off. When the American Revolution came along and George III started asserting his representation without taxation, they got rid of him. When Louis XVI said, I am the state, they got rid of him. And so what you're seeing is, and Trump, I can't assume whether he knew it or not, but he's tapped into the fact that the majority of Americans are tired of the extreme left, or the left wing and the right wing, the ideologues who think that they are the intellectual elite and know what's best for everybody else. And so you saw the rebellion against that. And so that's what's gone on. It's going on around the world. You're going to see it in other countries in Europe, with France, with Marie Le Pen, and so on. But the other point I wanted to add to Paul's point was, in the Agenda 21, which was, of course, the political agenda that Maurice Strong set up, and of which the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was part, and the IPCC was part, they also put in principles. And one of the principles was Principle 15. And I just wanted to read this to you because it speaks to what Paul was elucidating on. He says, in order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be widely applied. Okay, now the precautionary approach they're talking about is the precautionary principle, which environmentalists have always used. To heck with the facts, shouldn't we do it anyway? That's their argument. Well, shouldn't we do it just in case? So just to finish the Principle 15, in order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be widely applied by states according to their capabilities. Now, who decides that? Well, of course, they do. They decide what the capabilities are. So, you're too rich, we're going to take some of your money and give it to these poor people. So they've built that right into their assumptions. And then it goes on to say, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Well, okay, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage. Who decides that? They do. So they set up
Tim,
the
let me jump in on. Let me jump in on that just for a quick summary of how the precautionary principle really works. It's their decision. They look at the supposed dangers of using energy sources or chemicals. They never look at the dangers of not using those energy sources or chemicals, and they never talk about the benefits of the things they hate, the things they're against. It's all a one-way street. They get to pick and choose which chemicals, processes, technologies, and so forth they're in favor of, and everything else they bring the precautionary principle against.
Yeah, Paul, you're absolutely right. And of course, they've used one side in all of this. For example, when they set up the IPCC, they set up the theorem, and normally what happens is scientists, as skeptics, try to disprove the theory. They established it as proven right from the start. And Richard Lindzen at MIT years ago said the consensus was reached before the research had even begun. And then as some of the research, even though it wasn't funded and supported, it started to trickle in, they had to cover it up. they started changing the data. They started adjusting the data and dealing with only one side of it. And one of the things that, and if you look at in alternate energies, for example, nobody's ever done a true cost-benefit analysis. All we've heard is the benefits of it. But the cost of it, when you look at them even briefly, show you that they simply don't work. And they hired, the British government hired a fellow by the name of Nick Stern, who was recently in the news because at the London School of Economics, where he's got an agency within it, they were found to be falsifying publications. They were claiming as theirs, they were actually other people's, in order to get £9 million of grant money. Well, Nick Stern, is better known in the climate world as Lord Stern, because he got a title for his work. He produced the Stern Report, and Paul knows how influential that was. Well, this was a cost-benefit study done by an economist that only looked at the cost. And the IPCC report the same thing. I wrote an article saying, look, here's the benefits of global warming, and Paul referred to some of them earlier. And I got more hatred and attack for that than any other article I ever wrote.
Yeah,
and
Tim,
Paul's
you're bringing up
earlier,
this Stern report has its counterpart right here in the United States with the EPA's so-called social cost of carbon analysis, where they are looking at every conceivable, imaginary cost of using carbon-based fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. But they never look at the benefits of using those fuels, the incredible benefits that have lifted billions of people out of poverty and disease and early death. And they never look at the cost of the regulations they're imposing on us. So again, it's always a one-way street.
And Paul,
it's always a one-way street, always based on ideology first, decision first, and then find the evidence to back up what they're doing and ignore all the other evidence, silence all the people that are trying to find and present that other evidence. That's how the system works.
Exactly, and one of the things that I dealt with throughout my career, of course, is, you don't care about the planet, you don't care about the children or the future, that moral high ground that these people took.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what I get at with eco-imperialism. They want to take the moral high ground, so they say. But their policies are the ones that are condemning billions of people to perpetual poverty, disease, malnutrition, and early death. And I bring up the points of the things that they are against. One of my friends, and your friends, of course, is a fellow Vancouver resident, Patrick Moore, one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, who absolutely detests Greenpeace today because he says they've become anti-technology, anti-science, and anti-human. When you look at the opposition they've had to using pesticides, GMO, biotechnology, and modern energy, it's designed to help kill people off or keep them from living very long in the developing countries. They would never apply those policies against their own families or themselves, but they're against overpopulation by somebody else.
Well, gentlemen, I think this is a perfect segue to a break that we will have to identify our radio network. And if you'll hold a few moments, we'll have that break, and then we'll be right back.
Sorry, Dan, I got to take a brief intermission, and we'll continue with the Dan Happel Show. A story of a common family. So my daughter asked me a very important question. She said, Dad, why do you work so hard on this republic? And I answered her, well, baby, the republic as given by our founding fathers is the most important form of government ever given to man. She said, Dad, why don't you let somebody else do it? I said, well, sweetheart, most of America thinks things are okay. And so long as their lives are not upset, they don't have to care about the important things that are taking place in their own country. Your dad likes to do things. I just don't want to sit and wait for somebody else. And if we didn't have our founding fathers, we wouldn't have this country. They were doers. They wanted something great for their children and grandchildren. And sweetheart, so do I. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish I could say that that's what happens in almost every home of our country, but it's not. just 8 years ago as a man who watched an $800 billion bailout given to banks when that money could have paid off every home in foreclosure in this country, which would have resulted in the banks getting the money anyway. I realized that we had a problem. And I stood up and I did something about it. I'm asking you to do something about it. I'm asking you to not just listen to these phone calls. I'm asking you to go to republicfortheunitedstates.org and read the Declaration of Sovereign Intent. Understand what we have done over the last 8 years. Understand what our intention is, what we are desiring to do for the people of this nation, and do something about it. Participate in the phone calls. Participate in building your states. Participate in finding a governor, finding a leader, finding the body politic of people that are going to stand up and build the de jure state. This is what we need. We need you to do something about it. We need you to be doers. Wednesday night of every week, we have a Building the States phone call at 6 p.m. Pacific. We encourage you to get on this phone call and understand how you too can be a doer. Thank you. I yield.
Okay, we're back. I didn't want to delay that, but one of the quotes that I want to use, and I understand one thing, I think our guests fully understand this, and I want to amplify this a little bit. The fact that under the Green Movement, we're talking communism. There's no two ways about it. We're talking about a change from a world of free enterprise and capitalism under our system to a world of communism, and there's no question that that is the ultimate objective of the Green Movement, because if you look at the Green Movement, it takes away literally all of our individual rights, our liberties, our private property rights, and any number of things that we as Americans have taken for granted for a very long time. I've got one more quote, and then we'll get right back into the discussion, and this is actually a quote by Mikhail Gorbachev, who happened to be a good friend of Maurice Strong, who is also a Marxist, and together they worked on the climate change scenario for quite a long time. But this is a quote by Mikhail Gorbachev that was quoted in a special report called The Wiolence Project. It's War on Mankind by Marilyn Brannon. And this was in 1996. And this quote, "The threat of environmental crisis will be the international disaster key that will unlock the New World Order," unquote. Now, that's by Mikhail Gorbachev, who has always been a communist. He is acclaimed for his work on the Green Movement. He happens to be the founder of Green Cross, one of the more highly regarded international environmental organizations in the world. But the fact is, the Green Movement has been using a threat of the destruction of our environment to implement all of the communist policies that are part and parcel of world government controlled by a very select group of people. And with that, I'd turn this back over to you, gentlemen, because I think you're doing a marvelous job of fleshing out that very argument.
Well, thanks for having us on and doing that. This is why I call the environmentalists watermelons. They're green on the outside but red on the inside. And basically, this whole thing with climate change, it started out, as Tim pointed out, we're going to take a look at the possible human contributions to climate change. But over the next couple of years, it switched and it became, we're only going to look at human contributions to climate change, and then it changed a little bit more to the current position, which is only human beings are affecting climate change, and if we shut down our fossil fuel-based energy systems, we can control Earth's climate, which is just an absurd notion anyway. But it puts the UN and all these far-left people in control. I always laugh because I hear repeatedly Republicans and conservatives want to control what you do in the bedroom. Well, let's just accept that as accurate for the sake of argument. It's bogus, but let's just accept it. The reality is that the current crop of Democrats and the leftists and the communists, what's left of them, but those people on that other end of the political spectrum want to control everything we do outside the bedroom. So it's a no-win situation to a degree, but I'd rather have somebody control what I do in my bedroom than what I do the other 90% of the time.
Paul, can I jump in? I'm back online, thank goodness. Just finish up my point about India. Prime Minister Modi got a panel to look at it, and he said, you're telling us that the temperature might rise half a degree in the next 70 years, but you're not very certain about that. And he said, I've got bigger priorities. I've got 1/3 of my population without any electricity. I've got people starving to death. And that was the first time that we were able to trump that moral high ground of the environmentalists. And so, it's all about control. And by the way, we keep hearing about follow the money. I know
even moderately wealthy people in India, for the most part, don't even have refrigerators.
Yeah, exactly. But at a certain level, it's about power. And you really have to understand that. And, of course, the people that go for power know that the money will come with the power, but that's not their first objective. And so, it's all about controlling everybody and dictating to them how they shall behave and what they shall do. And of course, the opposite of that is freedom. And all people need to think about is if you hook up with somebody else, you're going to give up some freedoms, but you're going to get some benefits. But the more people you add to that group, every single person you add means one more of your freedoms is gone. And when you're at a world level, individuals don't count at all.
Well, absolutely right. And this is why the people, or the governments and the people of China, India, Indonesia, all those developing countries and emerging economic powerhouses are telling the people in the UN and IPCC, Al Gore, Barack Obama, you can have your climate treaty, but you can only have it in the way that you reduce your own economic growth and living standards and lifestyles. But you cannot tell us that we can't aspire to and achieve far higher living standards than we have today. We're going to need energy to do that. We're not going to stop using fossil fuels, and we're not going to worry about emitting carbon dioxide. And we want money from you in the meantime. You go over to India. The average temperature in India is pretty high. It's very warm. You're not worried about another half degree of warming certainly there, but they would certainly like to have some air conditioning and a way to control the climate inside their homes a little bit, and to have refrigerators, just to have electricity. As you say, over 1 billion people, 1.5 billion people worldwide do not have electricity. I, for one, cannot imagine my life without electricity. And to deny people around the world electricity, or tell them you can have a little bit of wind and solar-based electricity when it's available and nothing else, is to me a moral outrage.
Well, Paul, you're absolutely right. Of course, the forerunner to the whole Kyoto Protocol was the Montreal Protocol. They did a test run with the ozone issue. There never was a hole in the ozone. And one of the things, of course, that we produce approximately enough food every year to feed 26 billion people, but in countries like India, 60% of it never makes it to the table. Even in North America, it's 30%, but we've reduced by 30% by refrigeration. And what did they do? They banned CFCs. And what were CFCs produced for? They were produced to replace my mind's gone blank on the gas. But anyway, they were produced to create an inert gas. And then we said, you can't have that CFCs in refrigeration. because it's destroying the ozone. So the same pattern has gone on there. But I wanted to raise another point in this, Paul and Dan. One of the people that's central to all of this is John Holdren, who's science advisor to President Obama. Holdren, and underlying this, by the way, is not just that we want to control all the people, but we want to reduce the number of people in the world. Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, claiming that we're going to run out of resources. There are far too many people in the world, which is absolute nonsense. But that was central to this. And Ehrlich published a book with John Holdren about the eco-environment and the population and resources. And, of course, out of that came the Club of Rome and limits to growth, and the idea about peak oil was absolute nonsense. But one of the things that Holdren, and he denied that he believed in this anymore, but in that book, he said that indeed it has been concluded that compulsory population control laws, even including laws requiring compulsory abortion, could be sustained under the existing Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger the society. That's John Holdren, science advisor to President Obama. But look at that comment relative to Principle 15 I read to you earlier, because it says it has been concluded. Who concluded it? They did. And then it says, could be sustained under the Constitution if the population crisis becomes sufficiently severe. Who decides that? They do. So you see exactly the same idea there that's in that Principle 15. And Holdren, of course, has been, he's the guy that threw out the term polar vortex, which is absolutely meaningless. But he sits in the Obama White House pushing this whole agenda. And as I said, underlying it is not only do we need to reduce the resources and quality of life that people have, but we need to reduce the number of people that are on the planet. Well, who decides that? Well, apparently they do. So, and by the way, it's not surprising that eugenics is behind so much of this thinking.
Right,
Tim,
right. You're right about that. And one of the things that I'd like to mention is I think that's why the establishment was so completely thrown off guard by the fact that that President-elect Trump won the election, and he won that election because of the enormous groundswell of people that are sick and tired of the establishment. And I hate to say it, but the establishment is exactly what's behind all of these crazy ideas, because they believe that they're so much smarter than the rest of us that they should be able to dictate the terms of our entire civilization and our population and everything else.
That is absolutely on target. And Holdren and Obama also had something else up their sleeves. John Holdren in the same book said the first thing we need to do is de-develop the United States and Europe, Canada, and Australia. Reduce their level of development. And then, once we've achieved that, we can determine what level of development we will allow the other countries to have. This is just astounding when you think about the arrogance and the ideological drive behind these people, and with the power grabs that they have been able to engineer for themselves, feathering their own nests. They're going to get paid. They're going to have all the electricity and other power they want. They'll get to go to all these fancy conferences and five-star hotels, and it'll be like the Hunger Games, where the capital rules everybody else and everybody else lives in poverty and malnutrition. It's not a happy future, and that's part of what the red states, the red counties all over the United States rose up in righteous anger against last week in rejecting Hillary Clinton and the Democrats and voting in Donald Trump. If you look at a map of the United States, there's one out there called Can You Hear Us Now? And it shows that Trump has greater coverage in the United States than Verizon. It shows all the counties in the United States in red that went for Trump. And the only ones in the USA that were going for Hillary Clinton were essentially along the coast and in some of the bigger city areas. One of our clever guys around the D.C. area, Chris Plant, had an analysis the other day that I thought was spot on. He said, I just was reading some reports that show the impact that pollution has on people's thinking, their brain power, their development of their brains and intellects. And then I was looking at where all of the really greatest concentrations of pollution are, and they're in our big cities. And now you look at this map, and where were all the Clinton supporters? They're in our big cities. So there's connecting the dots for you.
Dan, can I just throw in a great irony in all of this, and that is that, and it's been known for at least 50 years, probably a bit longer. There's something called the demographic transition, and what this is that in every country where you get development, you end up with a declining population. In other words, if you want to control population or reduce population, you allow development. And in fact, this focus upon, too many people and all this poverty and so on. But look at, and many countries are masking the problem by immigration. And America's offsetting it. But if you look at Japan, where they don't allow immigration, we're one of the most racist countries in the world. You just don't get in there. Aoki, the golfer, who everybody thinks is a Japanese golfer, is in fact a third-generation Korean, and they won't allow him citizenship. But what you see happening in Japan is they've gone from 2.6 children, which is the minimum you require per family to maintain the population. They're down at 1.3. So you're seeing an aging population with not enough young people to support it. And you see it in Italy, where the Italian government are paying people to have a third child. You see it in Quebec, where Quebecers are being paid to have a third child. But, of course, in Quebec, it's very racist and political because they're only paying French Canadians. But when you allow development, you achieve these problems or this problem of reduced, or if you think it's a problem of reduced population. That's the great irony of it, so it's absolutely crazy. Nothing's logical about anything they're doing. And finally, the last comment I want to make is the world's preparing for warming, but all of the scientific evidence that I've looked at and know about is that the world is cooling. And as Paul referred to earlier, cooling is a much greater problem for the world. And all you have to do is go back and look in the 70s, when the world was cooling from 1940 to 1980, there were 3 CIA reports written about the impact of global cooling on the world in terms of food supply, social unrest, and everything else. So
yeah, and back then, Tim, back then, don't forget that the consensus of all the scientists was that the planet was cooling, it was due to fossil fuel use, and it was going to be a disaster. 3 years later, it switched. The planet started warming again, and then it was a total scientific consensus that the planet was warming. It was all caused by humans and fossil fuels, and it's going to be a disaster. And then when it stopped,
also, gentlemen, that was at the same time that John Holdren co-authored a book that talked about how the planet was cooling and we were moving into another ice age, and it was going to destroy our ability to produce food.
Right.
Well, of course, Stephen Schneider, a lot of these people have done this. They flip. They go from one trend to the next because, of course, that's where the panic and the funding is. I call it they jump on the trend wagon. And Stephen Schneider, who was very instrumental in setting up the IPCC and all of that, he was on the cooling wagon, and then he was on the warming wagon, and just before he died, he started to switch over to the cooling wagon again. And I was opposed to the cooling in the 70s just as I'm opposed to the warming now, because as Paul knows, looking at it, the temperature goes up and down, the temperature changes, the climate changes, and what's happening now is well within natural variability.
Yeah, and let's look at what happened after the global warming stopped, and we had 19 years of no warming. It was just flatlining. Then it became climate change. But the reality, as you look at it today, is the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets are growing. The seas are rising at maybe 7 inches a century. It's been 11 years since a single Category 3 to 5 hurricane struck the U.S. mainland, and the previous record was 9 years between Category 3 to 5 hurricanes. That was way back in 1860 to 1869. And this past, over the course of this year, U.S. tornadoes are, the number of U.S. tornadoes is at its lowest on record, dating back to the 1950s. So none of the climate change disasters have come to pass. The global cooling disaster hasn't come to pass. Maybe it will in the future thanks to cooling sun. And the global warming disaster hasn't come to pass. The only thing that hasn't changed is the demand that we shut down our fossil fuels, reduce our living standards, and put these guys in charge of everything we make, do, think, eat, and do.
Well,
exactly.
and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to address this because you are the real experts in this, but the bottom line is more CO2, no question. It's good for the environment because plant growth accelerates with more CO2. And one of the things that is a real positive of more CO2 is the fact that plants demand less water when they have a higher level of CO2. Could you both address that?
Important points. Thank you for bringing that up. That is so important for people to keep in mind. The more CO2 we have, the faster and better our forests and grasslands and crops grow, the less water they use, the less problem they have with droughts, and people are going to live better. They're going to have better nutrition. So what's the harm in all that?
Well, the empirical evidence is, of course, that they claim we're currently at 400 parts per million in the atmosphere, and all of the research done on this CO2 issue, and Patrick Moore, the former founder of Greenpeace, is now pushing this issue, but it's been around for a long time. Commercial greenhouses pump up to 1,200 parts per million into their greenhouses, which increases yields by a factor of 4, and as you correctly say, also reduces the amount of water that they demand. When you look at the geologic record, and Paul would be familiar with this, over the last 300 million years, when plants have evolved in that period of time, the average level of CO2 in the atmosphere was at approximately 1,200 parts per million. In other words, you could argue that at 400 parts per million right now, the plants are malnourished. And so any increase in CO2 for them would be beneficial. The other way to look at it is, of course, people like Gore demanding a reduction in the CO2 levels. And you've got that McKibben with his 350 parts per million. Once you go below 350 and approach 150, all the plants start to die off. And once you got no plants, you got no oxygen. And then maybe that's what they're trying to do, get rid of all the oxygen, which should get rid of all the people. So maybe, I don't know, but that's the problem and the insanity of what they're proposing.
It is insanity, and I hate to say this, gentlemen, but we're nearing the end of the program. I would like to mention the fact that there was a I think, famed debate, and I believe it was at Columbia University just a few years ago, where we actually had climate change zealots and gentlemen or people who were skeptics of the climate change debate, and they actually had an open public debate at, I believe it was at Columbia University, where 70% of the people that went into the public that went in to listen to this debate were actually convinced that climate change was an actual thing, man-caused climate change was an actual thing, and only 30% were skeptics. And by the time they went through this debate, the numbers were exactly reversed, and only 30% believed in man-caused climate change as being a major issue, and 70% were convinced that it was a fraud. Are you gentlemen aware of that particular debate? I'm sure you've seen something about it, and we are in the process right now trying to create an open public dialogue to get this debate before the American people so that we can have an honest scientific debate about the efficacy of man-caused global warming.
You're absolutely right about that debate. It was at Columbia, and one of the debaters was the late Michael Crichton, who was remembered for Jurassic Park and all those kinds of films and books, but he was a medical doctor and a medical researcher. He understood science. He wanted checks and balances and double-blind studies. He was denounced by Senator Barbara Boxer in the U.S. Senate, who could not tolerate somebody with knowledge coming in and contradicting her positions on climate change. So you're right, it flip-flopped the issue or the public perception within that audience, and this again is why these guys refuse to discuss or debate any of these issues with us and why they want to shut us up and shut us down. They don't want anybody out there allowed to present a contradictory point of view.
And of course, that's the point that Václav Klaus is making. It's climate or freedom. And just to illustrate the extent to which they're trying to shut people down, I've had 3 lawsuits. And in fact, right in the middle of one, it's being brought against me by Michael Mann, who produced the hockey stick, which became the poster child of proof of human-caused global warming. And so far, it's cost me $1 million in legal fees to defend myself. And of course, this is going. These charges would not be allowed in most of the United States because of the free speech issue. The rest of the world doesn't have that privilege, and I don't have it in Canada. And so I have to defend myself against comments that I made that people have said are defamatory. It really is frightening when you dare to stand up against these people, and you can understand why people are not willing to speak out because they see what happens to people like me. It really, the Trump election wasn't just about saving America. It was about saving the American, the whole Constitution and the whole point of America. The only country in the world that has free speech as its primary objective. And the Founding Fathers knew that you needed guns to defend it. And then the second thing is the private ownership of land, and that's under attack. We were talking about it in Australia when I was there recently. And, of course, the final thing that's going to be under attack, and Obama's done this already, is the Internet, because information is power, and the Internet is providing power to the people, and they want to stop that. They daren't allow that information to be out there. So we're truly seeing a critical turning point in the future of the Earth.
Yep, you're absolutely right, and that really brings us full circle back to Dan's original point about the New York and other attorneys general who were trying to use various RICO laws and other statutes to attack and silence and punish those who criticize their or disagree with their point of view. So, our basic fundamental freedoms, our rights to have limited government have been under assault, and hopefully this election is going to reverse that.
Well, we can certainly hope so, gentlemen, and I would suggest that under these RICO statutes, I believe that we should be prosecuting the attorneys general that are trying to take away our rights for free speech, and that, in fact, a number of these groups that have been in collusion with these attorneys general, and there's a number of environmental NGOs and foundations that I believe are very directly linked, that those RICO statutes go both ways, and I think maybe it's time for President-elect Trump to allow or to appoint an attorney general who actually believes that the RICO statute should be used against violators and not just for political gain. So, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for being a guest on our program, and I want to also mention that, Dr. Ball, you're going to be a speaker at the 3rd Annual Freedom Force International Congress in Phoenix, Arizona, and that will be in 2 weeks?
Yes, in 2 weeks.
Yeah,
and I think it's December 3rd to the 6th, I believe it is.
Well, I would ask folks that are our listeners if they would go to the website freedomforceinternational.org, and they can get more information on that site. about the Congress and about Dr. Ball's part in that Congress. And again, gentlemen, I want to thank you, and I would ask that you would consider being a guest again on our program because, frankly, we just barely broached the subject, and we've got a lot of things that we need to open to the public mind so that we can start to change this crazy selective mindset in this country and get back to free thought and freedom of speech.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Good talking with you, Paul.
It's been my pleasure as well, Dan and Tim. Thanks for joining me and
all right. Well,
carrying
I
this
welcome
information to your public.
I'm sorry?
Thanks for bringing this kind of information to your listening public.
Oh, you're quite welcome, and we are now reaching almost 5 million folks with this broadcast, and we really appreciate the fact that you gentlemen will put yourself at some personal risk by being honest about what's happening in our world. And with that, I will turn the broadcast back over to you, Kelby, and I'll ask our listeners to please join us again next week for another program. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is going to conclude the broadcast for this week. We want to thank you so much for coming to the Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. We'll see you next Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific. God bless. Good night.